Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Samara, and I am with JBS International. And before we begin today's session, I'd like to review some housekeeping items. Please note, all audio connections are muted at this time, and we ask that you please keep your lines muted for the duration of this session. If you have any questions or comments, please submit them by using the chat feature located at the bottom center of your Zoom window, or in the Whova chat on the right side of your screen. Questions will be addressed during the Q&A segment at the end of the presentation. If you experience any technical issues during this session, please message the host using the chat feature. Lastly, this is a recorded event and your participation grants consent to be recorded, and recording of this session and PowerPoint slides will be available and sent to participants at a later date. And now I will turn it over to the moderators who will introduce our speakers.
Great, thank you, Samara. Hello, yes, welcome everyone. My name is Catherine Kennedy. I am with the Federal Office of Rural Health Policy here at HRSA. And myself, along with John Roberts with JBS International, will be your moderators today. So we would like to welcome you to today's session, Effective Leadership for Community Consortiums. So presenting at this session today, we have Dr. J.K. Costello, who is the Director of Behavioral Health Consulting at the Steadman Group. Dr. Costello is a physician and a consultant on population health for addiction. Also joining us from the Steadman Group, we have Lindsay Houston, who is a behavioral health consultant. Lindsay has experience in substance use disorder policy, program design, and implementation. And she is also currently working on 2 HRSA RCORP grants. So the full bios for the speakers can be found in the session subscription under the agenda on the Whova platform. So with that, I will turn it right on over to Dr. J.K. Costello.
Thanks, Catherine. My name is J.K. Costello, and we hope that we're working on a 3rd HRSA RCORP grant after the deadline a couple weeks ago. So thanks for any strings you can pull on that. My name is J.K. Costello, and I'm a physician and consultant with the Steadman Group. We're a women-owned consulting firm in Denver, and I'm the director of our behavioral health consulting group. And with me is my colleague, Lindsay, and I'll let her introduce herself on the next slide. So this is a leadership talk, and I'm sure you've heard a lot of leadership talks about how if you get rid of all your plates except one, you're going to be a better leader. And our session is not about that. This is really about giving you some instrumental things that you can enact in your consortium that'll help you run it better. And I think that we are qualified in this because we took over facilitating a HRSA implementation grant that by all accounts wasn't going that well, and now we feel like it's doing really well. So we've got a lot of tangible solutions that we think you can use in your group. And I'm going to totally ruin the surprise and say, if there's one thing that I think most groups can do better as far as leadership in their consortium, it's really putting recovery at the center of the consortium. And more specifically than that, even putting people in recovery at the center of the consortium. So I've been, I'm coming up on 7 years in recovery myself. And so this is not just a shameless, selfish plug that I should be at the center of the consortium. It's really the idea that nothing for us without us, and that people who are still actively using or in recovery are best suited to outline their needs in a community. And so we found that since we started emphasizing this and really seeking out people from the recovery community and trying to include people who are still using, the focus in our groups has become a lot more clear. The purpose is really clear, and there are some ways that we do that that are tangible. And one of those that I'll tell you just to illustrate, I think the best example of this that we do, I was charged with facilitating a discussion on criminal justice, and we had a district attorney, and we had people that worked at the state, and we had a guy, we had a cop, and they handed me the roster, and I said, oh, these people are really knowledgeable, but we don't have anybody who's ever been involved in the criminal justice system. And this was a week before our meeting, and I said, can we get somebody who's been involved in the criminal justice system? And somebody actually in our partnership said, we can get a guy who's in jail right now. And through working with the sheriff, captain actually in the jail, who is really, really proactive about substance use, and having a willing friend of theirs, actually the people that we knew, it was his friend who were in jail, and some open-minded people on the panel who are willing to give up some of their time. We got a guy who was in handcuffs in jail to be part of our panel. And I think everybody who attended the education agreed that was the best thing that happened that day. It was just the emphasis and the effort that went into getting this guy to talk, and his energy and his newness in recovery really changed the way everybody thought about how how we could better improve prevention, treatment, and recovery in Northwest Colorado. And so I'll probably repeat that throughout our talk, but I just want to start off with that another way we do that in more pedestrian ways is every other meeting we have, we can't quite get every meeting, but every other meeting we have, we start with somebody in recovery who lives in the Grant region speaking and talking about their experience in treatment or recovery, and whatever pathway they've taken, we have them talk about that to the extent they're comfortable with. And so I hope those are a couple really concrete tips that if you're not doing already, you can put in your consortiums to improve leadership in your RCORP grant. And we're on the correct slide, and I'll hand it off to Lindsay.
Thanks, JK. So as JK mentioned, my name is Lindsay Houston. I am also a behavioral health consultant with the Steadman group. We are based in Colorado, so a different region than what's on here today. But JK and I are based on the Front Range. Two of the grants that we've been really fortunate to work with, who are our clients and who we're lucky enough to project manage and facilitate alongside our Memorial Regional Health, which is in the Steamboat area of Colorado, if you're familiar with that, and then SCL St. Mary's, which is in the Grand Junction area of Colorado. So big shout out to both of our project directors. That's Paula Belcher on Memorial, and then Dr. Ryan Jackman on St. Mary's. And as JK mentioned before, we both project manage and facilitate those grants. So that's why we're here with you today, to share some examples of leadership that we've encountered along the way, and to hopefully share some tips and tricks with you guys for really running these grants smoothly, and most importantly, getting a lot of engagement and participation out of your consortium, whether you're in a planning grant or an implementation grant or one of RCORP's other grants as well. So the structure that we're going to use to talk about that today are the phases of team development. And JK is going to tell you a little bit about the origin of that development framework, but we'll start out with forming. And JK, you can tell them a little bit about the background.
I use this framework all the time because it's helpful to understand where your group is. And I think depending on what grant you're working on, you're probably in a different stage here, but this was started by Bruce Tuckman in 1965, and it is still very applicable. There's actually another phase after forming, storming, norming, and performing of mourning or adjourning, but it's just too painful, and we're not going to address that one. So we're just doing the first four here. And we also hope that your consortium sustains for beyond the period of performance for the RCORP grant. And we have some tips on that as well, but we're going to go over these four today, and I'll hand it off to Lindsay for the next slide.
Thanks, JK. And we can swap to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the forming stage is the very first stage for the group development that we're going to go over today. And the forming stage really lays the foundation of what your consortium is going to look like and how successful it's going to be. So forming is when the team meets and learns about opportunities and challenges, and then agrees on goals and begins to tackle the tasks. So for us, this forming stage really starts immediately before we even apply for a grant. So when we're working with an organization like Memorial Regional Health or St. Mary's, who might be thinking about starting a grant and thinking about who's at the table right now for that application period. So when we're thinking about that, we really want to make sure we have the entire continuum of care represented at that table in the early phases. And you'll notice that that continuum of care really covers the prevention, treatment, recovery, harm reduction, some workforce development, and those really align well with the mandatory core objectives that you guys are probably familiar with in a lot of your work plans that HRSA puts forth for their grants. So making sure we have the right folks at the table and representing all of the regions in our grant. So making sure that we have each county represented. On our initial planning grant for SCL, we had 12 counties that we were representing, which was a massive service area. For implementation, we pared that down. That was one of our big lessons, but really trying to have as many people, the big players in the game across that continuum of care is vital to making sure that A, you have a successful grant application, and you get awarded funding, but more importantly, on the other end of making sure you have a successful grant that's really meaningful for the region as well. And then perhaps just as importantly of who's at the table is who's missing at the table. So what organizations or gaps have you identified of organizations that might not be represented? And an organization that's a great example of this that we just filled the gap on one of our grants with this was we didn't have great Hispanic representation in one of our regions, really none to be frank, and that was a massive gap area that we identified in talking with our partners and work groups. And so we outreached to a great organization in Eagle County called Heart's Reign and brought them into the consortium. And they are completely Hispanic run, and they're getting acquainted with recovery services and work in the region, and they're going to partner up with us on a lot of our initiatives to make sure that that group of people are represented in the region adequately. So making sure that partners are identified early, so in the writing phases, and then making sure that engagement stays there throughout the duration of the grant is really important, and what we're going to touch on today for some tips and tricks to how to make that happen. But we also want to acknowledge that people do drop out sometimes, and I think a lot of you maybe have experienced that with COVID, especially public health agency partners who have been very involved with the response for COVID, have gotten sucked into that work and maybe pulled off your consortiums a bit. So checking in with organizations who have stopped attending consortium meetings, stopped attending work group meetings, seeing A, why they've dropped out, and B, what you can do to support them in order to help them regain participation is another area that's been really important for our work as well. And one that we recently experienced with a public health agency on our memorial grant of they had to kind of drop back and take a back seat for the past couple of months, but recently re-engaged as they've come up for air, and checking in with them to seeing how their work's going with COVID and making sure they can plug into our current work plan and where we're at today has been really important as well. And then another area of that early and often part for engaging people is with the letters of support and commitment, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with when you're starting to put a grant together, of who to have sign a letter of commitment or support for your grant application, and making sure that those are really meaningful letters, whether that be an Office of Behavioral Health at the state level or a small nonprofit faith-based organization too. So just making sure that there's a broad breadth of people who are committed to your work, even before you're awarded funding, really lays the groundwork for a successful grant in the long run once awards have been given out. And keeping that momentum going is also key. And one way that JK and I try really hard to make sure that happens is making sure that folks feel valued who are a part of our work. And that can look a few different ways. But one of the most basic forms of that is making sure that we pay people for their time. And so for those of you who are familiar with the performance improvement measures, AKA PIMS, which I think a lot of you probably just submitted, I know we did on both of our implementation grants, is that PIMS is a really heavy lift for our provider groups. And we want to ensure that those people are compensated for their input and for their data and their time that they're putting into that. And so we built into all of our budgets some funding in order to support them. I think it's $2,000 per organization that submits their PIMS if they're a provider group. And then we also have regional work group leads on our St. Mary's grant, and those folks are also compensated for their time as leaders and representing the work groups and all the work they do in there. So making sure that people feel valued is a key part of keeping that momentum and participation moving along. And JK has a few other things to touch on here before we change slides.
Thanks, Lindsay. Yeah, I can't agree enough with paying people for their time, because people can drop off for several reasons. One of them is that they don't find it's valuable, and that means that we're not doing our jobs. It could be also that their boss doesn't seem to find it valuable enough, or feels like they have something better to do. And so if we oblige people to attend work groups through a letter of commitment, and we compensate them with cash, then we usually get better attendance, and they have some time earmarked out of their week to carry forward work between the meetings, because that's really important. That's where the substance of implementation gets done. We found is that we actually don't end up spending that much money on things, certainly not on tangible things, but really we need people to move things forward in between meetings, and money is a good way to do that, in addition to making them feel valued. So as Lindsay said, we usually try to divide, and this might be helpful for people who are doing their planning grant and are working on implementation. Try to divide our letters of commitment, and we have a shared letter of commitment that 5 to 8 people sign, and we try to get pretty even division between prevention, treatment, and recovery, as well as harm reduction, so that we have really good representation from all fields when we determine who's at the table. And then usually we don't find out who's missing until later. But often, to get people to sign that letter of commitment, we just ask them, what's something that you've wanted to do for a while? What's a program you've wanted to expand that is in the OUD, SUD space? And they usually have something at the ready. And we say, oh, you want to train your folks on youth mental health first aid? Like that's easy. We can write that into the grant. And so it helps us fill out our budget, and it helps secure letters of commitment from them as we're forming the group. So yeah, identifying partners early and often, and we'll go through this as we talk about storming norming. We're constantly re-identifying partners and reforming the group, which is a lot harder, because I don't have a timer or a reminder. My dad, like when we sent Christmas cards, he had like a note of whether somebody had sent him a Christmas card every year for the last 10 years. And then he stopped sending them if they didn't send him a letter for 3 years. We're not that exact, but if I notice that somebody hasn't come to work group, and particularly our work groups, because that's where the work gets done, I reach out to them and I say, hey, let me know what's going on. Can you start attending more work groups? Is there something you need from us? And sometimes I'll reach out to somebody else at the organization and say, hey, is there somebody that's more appropriate who you'd like to send to the work group meeting? And recently we did that with a larger treatment center in the area that is not focused on Medicaid. And so it's been harder to get their buy-in, because we're really focused on uninsured and Medicaid folks. But they're really core, as far as they do a lot in the community. They run a lot of meetings, they have a lot of aftercare. And so they're really important to the whole recovery and treatment apparatus in the region. And we want to make sure they get on board. So I both followed up with the person who's supposed to be attending, and also reached out to the executive director to get him on board, or somebody else from the organization. So we're pretty dogged about getting people back if they leave the group, and figuring out why that's happening. And then, as Lindsay said, we're constantly recanvassing and finding new people. I would say a third of our work group from when we started facilitating a year ago are new people, like completely new people who we didn't know about a year ago. And that's expanded us into social services, faith-based recovery. There were several faith-based recovery organizations nobody knew about, because they didn't interact with the other parts of the consortium. And they've been really important in expanding our consortium's continuum. Next slide.
So the next stage after that forming is called storming, and stereotypically the storming phase is sometimes when personalities clash. For us, that's typically not what happens, but the storming phase is when the group members start to work with each other, and they learn about individual working styles and what it's like to work with each other as a team. And it's also the time when different hierarchies and statuses or positions in the group start to be identified. So positions of leadership and things like that. But for us, the storming phase really starts happening right after the grant's awarded, and we start building out the structure of the consortium as a whole, and what we want our leadership structure to look like for that. And that really all links back to the work plan. And so during storming, breaking out those work plan goals, and deciding how we want to allocate resources to that, and which work plan initiatives we want to work on first, is a key part of that. One thing that we found that's been really helpful has been breaking the work plan down into, we like to call them low-hanging fruit, which are easy objectives that are fairly short, and they have a series of concrete steps associated with them. So an example of that would be obtaining naloxone. Here in Colorado, our state has a state naloxone bulk fund that you can really easily apply to. You just fill out a form and send it in. You can get a standing order, and then the state will mail you a bunch of naloxone for your organization. So that's pretty short term. It's probably about a month for us to get all those applications together, help troubleshoot any problems for that, and then the organizations will receive the naloxone shortly thereafter. Mental health first aid trainings is another really great example of that. We have that written into our work plans, and we have a number of organizations who have the mental health first aid trainers on hand. And so getting dates for that, hosting the trainings, pretty straightforward, not a nuanced process. But pairing those with longer term objectives that might take a bit longer. So thinking on the 3 to 10-month time frame, or even a year for some of the really big ones, leads to a lot of momentum and participation for folks, because people feel like they're accomplishing things with those low-hanging fruit objectives. And then you also have longer term things that are going to take a little bit and frankly might have some barriers to them to troubleshoot, like piloting a peer program in the emergency room. That's definitely not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a lot of stakeholders involved in that process to make it happen. And so pairing those low-hanging fruit objectives and then the long-term ones lets people check things off a list and proceed along and feel like they're accomplishing items, but then have longer term things to sink their teeth into that take a bit as well. So another thing that we try really hard to have happen in the storming phase is lavishing time for networking, even in our short meetings. So all of our consortium meetings, we have those monthly. They have time for work groups to report out on their initiatives regionally, and that happens also in the work groups too. There's always a time at the beginning of the agenda for all of our work groups to report out on what's happening at their organization, if they had any new hires recently, like a new peer, or maybe if there's a training happening in the region that they can talk about. And that really lets consortium partners get to know each other, but also know about the resources in the region as a whole. And as JK mentioned before, sometimes there's organizations in the region that the big provider groups didn't know about, like the faith-based organizations or smaller nonprofits. And so this gives time people to get to know each other, get to know strengths and weaknesses as far as different group members in the work groups and the consortium, as well as just who's doing what. And another thing in the storming phase that we found to be really imperative and useful to put the time in early on is developing a communication strategy, like from the get-go. So before the grant even starts, as soon as it gets awarded, figuring out who a point person is for that, as well as the leadership on the grant, and who, as far as the project manager, what their roles will be, what the project director's roles will be, where will communication be coming from, and the frequency of that. So developing a clear leadership, like organization chart is really helpful for that, with roles and responsibilities and point people. So on both of our federal grants that we've been talking about today, Memorial and St. Mary's, I'm the point communication person. So all communications come from me, only from me. They happen regularly on a weekly basis. And then we have our monthly consortium meetings and work groups beyond that. But it's really clear who's doing the communication. And then there's also a really easy access point for people to ask questions or to troubleshoot any issues they might be having and that kind of thing, and to get involved with different initiatives. So I'm that entry point person on both of the grants. And JK, you have a couple of more things to be touching on here as well, I think.
I do. So quote about the storming stage: at this stage, there's positive and polite atmosphere and people are pleasant to each other and they have different feelings of excitement, eagerness, and positiveness, and others may have feelings of suspicion, fear, and anxiety. And I think as facilitators, we have really worked to allay suspicion, fear, and anxiety. Frankly, a lot of these, working in a rural area, the stages of group development is a little different in that a lot of the people in our consortiums know each other really well already, like better than we know them. And so I feel like some of the storming has been allayed, and maybe you've experienced that in some of your consortiums as well, that we haven't experienced a whole lot of conflict, and where we have, it's been really good, frankly. So as facilitators, one of the big things that I feel like I've done during the storming phase is try to shape people's contributions so that they're right-sized. Because our work groups, we have really good sized work groups, especially in Northwest Colorado. We've got about 7 to 10 people normally show up for work groups, which I think is the optimal size for a working group. And that everybody can talk, everybody knows who each other is, and there's accountability just naturally. And if it gets bigger, then that gets diffused. But during the storming phase, we've really worked to help people who don't speak a lot to be involved, and help people who speak a lot to listen to other people. And there's one person in particular, I often check in with her before meetings and ask, hey, is there anything you want to talk about? And can you fit it into 4 minutes? So that it's pretty clear what the scope of her role in this meeting is. And then likewise, if there are people who aren't used to talking, I email them before the meeting and ask them, hey, will you be there? I'd like you to talk about this project that you're doing. And so we get roughly equal contributions from people, I'd say averaged over a few meetings. It's not always at every meeting. But I think that's helped with the storming phase is to like get everybody involved and at a right level. And I see a couple questions in the chat. Kenneth Smith, this is a great question. And frankly, one we haven't figured out. So I'll just tell you what our experience has been with governance and accountability. Our 2 grants that we facilitate have very different governance structures. One of them's super loose. There's really no official membership. And we, people come and go into the work groups. We have lists, email lists, but there's no voting membership. There's really no, fixed hierarchy of how they work, except for the project director and then us as facilitators. And that doesn't seem to have been a problem for us. We've had nothing really come to a vote, nothing come to a contested vote on that grant. One of the differences on that grant is that our budget is really well set in stone. Like a lot of it is going to full-time or part-time personnel. And so there's not a lot of discretionary spending on that grant. So there's a lot less voting. But honestly, that's worked pretty well. And in our other grant, we have a formal membership that people apply for. We vote them in, we have voting members, and it's 1 person from each organization, which sounds great. Like it sounds really clear. It's actually been more of a hassle than any benefit from it. Like, because often we'll have 3 or 4 people from the same organization, and they don't know that only one of them can vote. And then we have quorum rules, and quorum rules have been horrible, honestly, because, sometimes only 40% of the people in the consortium show up, and then we haven't reached quorum, right? And so we can't take a vote. And so I would actually, my favor is probably a little bit more toward the less structured governance model as far as your voting membership and who is a member in the consortium. We do have official positions in that, like, there are people who are paid as facilitators or people paid for their PIMs, but it doesn't elevate them to any like voting, special voting level. In most grants, I feel like things are fairly consensus based. So that's my suggestion is start with it pretty loose, because now we are in the one grant progressively loosening our governance structures to make it fit like the quorum rules, and so that we don't have to keep track of who else is a voting member. That just seems a little bit easier to me. And then accountability, accountability, we meet every 2 weeks in work groups, which that's a concrete recommendation that I would hand to everybody for at least your first couple years. We meet every 2 weeks, and people have a good memory of what happened in the last meeting. I find if I go a month or 2 months, I don't really remember what happened. And so we check in pretty frequently on things. And so accountability has been very favorable. We meet 45 minutes. It's a really quick meeting, and we follow up on everything. So new business from one meeting becomes old business at the next meeting. And old business, everybody gets checked in with, usually before the meeting. I email them a few days beforehand. And I think a lot of them don't do anything before I email them, but I email them 3 days before the meeting, and then they do what they're supposed to do. And then they can report back at the meeting. So, I wouldn't say accountability has never been an issue, but those are some of the things we do to make accountability more facile for everyone, to meet more frequently and then to check in before meetings so that people aren't surprised. And then we also, Lindsay will talk more about this, but we also follow up after our meetings. All our to-dos are very clear at the bottom of the agenda or the minutes. We explicitly state the to-dos at the end of each meeting. And so I feel like accountability has been pretty easy for us. And I know that's not always the case. I'll hand off the next two questions, what the PD, PM, and PI do, to Lindsay.
Sure, yeah, it can certainly look different on different grants, obviously, but for us, on our Memorial and St. Mary's grant, the PD on it really serves as a final decision point on a lot of things. They're involved in, obviously, the monthly HRSA TA calls, any voting matters they obviously have a say on. And then we've also made a point of having that person report out on the budget periodically to be really transparent about our spending practices. One of those grants has had a little bit of a hard time spending down their budget, just as a result of having a little bit of a late start, like hitting the ground running. And so we have some things that we need to spend down after our first year here. And so the project director has been really transparent about all budget things and spending, and we make a point of having them report out on where we are with that. So that's the project director. And then JK and I serve as project facilitators. So we're contracted in for both of those grants and written in on the budget. And our role is really to head up all of the communications for both of those grants. So I'll touch on this in a few slides, but I send out a weekly email update to the entire consortium with where we're at work group wise, any consortium business that's upcoming, and things like that. So we run the communication side of things and then also facilitation. So we're both a part of all the work groups that are happening on the grant as well. And we assist some of the work group leads in getting that work done and structuring the meetings. We do all the scheduling for the meetings and things like that as well. But we also are in charge of facilitating the monthly consortium meetings and putting together the PowerPoint presentations for that and bringing in speakers and things of that nature. I'm trying to see what other questions there are as well. Oh, there's a lot. Thanks for being engaged, everyone. Planning. In our planning grant, the question is about how often is too often for meeting during the planning grant. So in our planning grant with St. Mary's, we met every 2 or 3 months, I think, JK, correct me if I'm wrong, as a consortium as a whole for in-person meetings. And we had a few virtual ones beyond that. So JK and I and our evaluation team traveled down to Grand Junction and did in-person meetings there. And then we spread it out to a couple of other counties that were on the grant as well to be equitable for where we were hosting those. So we had our in-person meetings every 2 or 3 months on that grant, which was a year, but our work groups were still meeting every 2 weeks. So that was really the key to keeping the planning grant moving. And I'm sure, as you guys are well aware, the planning grant has a lot of like paper deliverables that have quite a bit of writing involved with them, with needs assessment and sustainability plans and things of that nature. And so meeting regularly in the work groups to keep that work moving was really key. And now that we're in implementation, we have less formalized deliverables that are like written due date type deliverables, but more activities of naloxone distribution and things like that. So I really can't emphasize enough how important those work group meetings are. They're definitely more important than the consortium wide meetings.
And I would say we've said a lot about work groups. Back up to Kenneth's question, we just assumed like, oh, you do prevention, treatment, or recovery work groups. And that's what we did for our planning grant in one region and then for this other grant. And that actually, one of the things we changed as far as, I don't know if I call it governance, but definitely organization, was in the bigger grant region in which there were 12 counties and we now have 5. We just, for people going from planning and implementation, we cut people that didn't participate in the planning grant. Some of them were small, some of them were big. And our TA people said, hey, if there are counties that aren't participating, you should cut them out. And great decision, like great decision. It's still a big region. We probably have 150,000 people in the region between the 5 counties and maybe 120 and 5 counties. So we actually split it up, and the work groups now are regional. And so we have a lot of mountain passes in Colorado. So essentially the mountain passes make the groups, and the groups now are more tight knit regional people, and they do all of prevention, treatment, and recovery. So I would, I would consider breaking into work groups unless you have a really small consortium, and titrate that to, like I said, having 5 to 10 people at every meeting. And then also look at, you don't have to do prevention, treatment, recovery. You can change it up different ways that meet your geography's needs. Geez, lots of questions. So Felicia, I'll give my best guess and then hand off to Lindsay. I mean, members, like you said, we have email lists, and I think for our big group, like we probably have 100 or 120 people on our email list. People that actually participate actively in the work groups, I would guess we have 40 to 50, and they are from everything. And this kind of goes to Beverly's question too. It sounds like you're in a pretty large small town. If you have a behavioral health facility and you have a OBOT MAC clinic and a hospital, I mean, we have, oh my gosh, at least 15 organizations involved in each region. So it's probably 40 different organizations, and we have everything from youth prevention. We have statewide organizations that come and attend our regional meetings. We've got anybody doing MAT, definitely we have on board. Most of the hospitals we have on board. Community recovery, we have a ton of recovery community organizations. Target service area is 56,000. So pretty good size for a HRSA grant. I mean, that's one thing we've got really good. Like just in one of our little counties, just in one part of one of our counties, we've got 2 recovery community organizations, a harm reduction organization. And so a good rule of thumb that I'm going to say later is like 10 to 20% of people should be in recovery or from recovery organizations. So I think that there's no, like we've never said no to anybody. Nobody said, we want to join your group. And we've said, no, you're just not involved enough with opioids. We always find a way to fit them in. A lot of social services, a lot of, we try to engage like Hispanic cultural organizations or outreach organizations, just because, especially in rural areas, there's not usually a SUD focused Hispanic organization. And so we work with Community Budget Center is one in Northwest Colorado that is neither Hispanic nor SUD focused, but they do a lot of work with Hispanic people, and we want to meet people where they're at and engage groups that have engagement amongst hard to reach populations. So I would just say, like, spread your wings as far as possible. And if you've got too many people, then you can start paring back. But so far, that's not been a problem for us.
Yeah, one other quick example that I'll give of an organization that's not inherently based in substance use work at all is the Colorado Workforce Center, which on our memorial grant in the Steamboat area, they're involved in our treatment work group. And they actually gave a really great presentation on how to make relevant and good job postings specifically for peer recovery workers, which is something some of our consortium members have been struggling with, was retention for those folks. So they talked about some best hiring practices in general, help some folks out with writing a job post that would be relevant specifically for those kinds of workers. And then also they've posted some job postings for us as well. Right now we're working on a transportation initiative, and we need drivers in the region for the memorial grant. And so we've outreached with them, and they've used their networking and resources to post some jobs related for us as well that we've been seeking and needing to fill. So all sorts of people have been engaged in our work. And I'm going to save the PIMS question for at the end of this conversation, just so that we can keep moving here. But Beverly, I will come back to you in PIMS, I promise. All right. So Stormy, I think we're wrapped up on that if you want to move us to the next slide. So I think a lot of you may have seen this slide previously with similar questions from Dr. Mary Kay earlier today, but if you could all use the chat box to describe what your consortium has looked like over the past 2 months. and using the words unsettled, unfocused, engaged, focused, or visionary, just to see where folks are at. We did a similar question at the Colorado regional meeting of this, and most people seem fairly focused, but this is a totally different region, so I'll be interested to see people's responses. I see a couple unsettled, some mostly focused, unsettled. Great. Well, we're glad that everyone could be here. It sounds like there's some folks that might be struggling along a little bit, and other folks who are doing well. And I hope everyone can have some takeaways from the presentation today to help us all progress here, so that we can all get to that really focused visionary stage. Next slide, please. So we've touched a little bit about communication and the importance of that, but I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the nuts and bolts of how we've structured that for our grants and what's been helpful for us so far. And hopefully you can take away a few tidbits from this. So effective communication as the key communicator on both of our federal grants. For me, I really try to be regular with the communication, clear, purposeful, and so that everything has a value and is value driven and relates back to the work plan as well. So I'll walk us through the steps here. But for us, the communication patterns that we've developed that have been really beneficial have been one email update a week for the entire consortium. And I break that down into three main areas of consortium business. So if we have things that we're going to be voting on in the near future, I put that in there. If we have new work group members, that lives under consortium business, or a spending initiative that's going to be coming up, that would go in there. I also have a did you know? And the did you know is really about highlighting one work group and an accomplishment they made. So did you know that River Valley recently started hepatitis C treatment in their clinic, something like that, a fun fact of somebody's success in our region, or it could be somebody that's hosting a training or a new recovery community organization that's opened up. And then we also have a spot for outside events and opportunities. And so in that area, I highlight regional things that are not necessarily a part of our grant, but that would be beneficial for our members to know about or attend. And that's also the area where I put in HRSA's webinars. So a lot of you probably get HRSA's weekly TA resource portal email, and there's a bunch of webinars as well as toolkits that are always listed in there. And I kind of screen through those and pick and choose ones that I think would be relevant to our work group and our grant based on the initiatives I know that we're working on. So that lives in there too. And the email again is just once a week. It's super clear, short, it's bullet pointed. It looks the same every week. It goes out on Mondays for our memorial grant. And it also has action items in it. So if I need folks to do something like vote using SurveyMonkey, that action item is in there and highlighted. And the purpose of those emails is to really keep the entire group informed of what's happening. The work groups are awesome, and again, is where a lot of the work happens, but it can also mean that folks get a little bit siloed and don't know what's happening across work groups. And so this email is just a really easy blanket way to keep people informed of that. And it also reminds people that this grant is ongoing and that things are getting done too. So beyond the email update, there's also the consortium-wide meeting that we talked about. So all consortium members and participants are at that meeting. That call usually has about 25 to 50 people on it, depending on the grant that we're working on. And that happens once a month. It's a standing meeting. We decide on the time at the very beginning of the grant, and it stays the same throughout the lifespan of the grant. So folks get it on their calendar and it just stays on there. That meeting always has guest speakers that are a part of it. Like JK mentioned earlier, we try to have somebody who's in recovery share their story of recovery at the start of those meetings every other month. And any voting items that are a part of that get announced ahead of time so that people can review the resources and be informed for the voting too. And the purpose of that meeting is really to celebrate all the achievements, bring the work groups together to share out what they're doing verbally. bringing guest speakers and experts on topics. So we've had Heidi Williams come from Colorado, and she works with the Attorney General's office and is the head of the Opioid Task Force. So she's come to both of the grants on a number of occasions to give us updates on settlement funding dollars and what allocation might look like for that. And so our purpose of our consortium-wide meetings is to bring everyone together, share those achievements and accomplishments, but it's also a time to vote on things too, if there is formal voting. Like JK mentioned, our grants are structured a little bit differently, and on one we do have really formalized voting. So last week we voted to induct a new faith-based organization into the consortium. We also voted recently to allocate $50,000 or so to a training program for mental health first aid that one of our prevention organizations was doing. So we did that during the call. And then where the real work happens are in those bi-monthly or twice a month work group meetings. And as JK mentioned before, those work groups are usually quite a bit smaller. Of the 6 to 10 people is a pretty good number we've found, where everyone has to talk at that number. Everyone has items that they're responsible for and connected to. So the bi-monthly work group meetings, again, are standing meetings that happen at the same time every month. We have leaders for each of those that are responsible for setting the agenda and getting it out a couple of days ahead of time, 2 to 3 days ahead of time. We found has been a great way to jog people to remember their to-do items that they were supposed to do from the last time, if they know they're going to be reporting out on it. And the work groups are really a great spot for folks to put their name next to certain objectives in the work plan and really own that objective in the work plan, and be committed to supporting it all the way through from start to finish. And we make a point on our consortium-wide meetings, the big monthly ones, to call folks out by name who have really achieved something great in the work group or have contributed something, like if they made a flyer on harm reduction or something like that, to really call those folks out by name and praise them. And that's another way that we really show value, I think, for the members who are a part of this work. And then kind of the overall catch-all for all of this information for communication lives in a shared Google Drive folder that we set up at the very beginning of the grant. And that Google Drive folder is accessible to anyone in the consortium. It has all of our meeting minutes in it, all of our PowerPoint presentations, but each work group also has a shared folder in there as well. So all meeting minutes for that particular work group, as well as any documents that they're working on in there, also lived in that shared Google folder. And again, that's really to show transparency of the work that's happening across the grant as a whole and within the work group so that things aren't as siloed. And JK, I know you have a few things you're going to touch on for budget and website.
Yeah, one thing I can't emphasize enough is transparency in budgeting. We meet at least once a year, every 6 months, and we go over the budget at a pretty high level of detail and let people see what's being spent, how much money is left. And I find that that engenders a lot of trust. I've worked on SAMHSA grants before where the PD didn't do that, and I felt like, I don't know, I wasn't sure what was going on with the spending. We also, for one of our grants, have a website, and this is something I'm not a fan of websites. If you can't tell, like, I really care about substance use and getting implementation of effective programs. I don't always see the purpose in communication, especially with people outside the consortium, but it's really, really important for sustainability and for, beyond, even during the grant, to get people to stay engaged and to sustain the efforts beyond the period of the grant, that hospital CEOs and exec directors of nonprofits see what you're doing and not just the people in the consortium. And the website, it's launched, it's still in the building phase, but that helps with that communication and really doesn't require a lot of upkeep on our part. We outsource this to somebody. So our website it actually has a cool dashboard that gets updated by our state prescription drug consortium. So we just put in the code and it updates every few weeks. We've got a splash page. We're going to have all our notes on there. We're going to have a treatment locator so that we're going to have segments for the public, for stakeholders and for consortium members. Oh, and we've also got a recovery ready workplace initiative where we're tying into some national organizations that we're going to put on our website. So one of our groups has a website, one doesn't. I think that's something, that's up to you, but it is an option. And the nice thing about what you don't see in this effective communication matrix is like everything rolls into other communications. So our minutes roll up into our weekly update. And then our minutes roll up into our monthly big group meeting when we give the update. And then some of these other communications will roll up into our website. And so we're getting multiple uses every time we prepare some communications. The marketing initiative that we're commissioning, a lot of those things will go on our website in addition to social medias. And so we're getting, we're not reinventing the wheel every time we do communications. And that's been really helpful. But
the other thing that I'll add to communications real quick is getting a logo if you don't have one already, which sort of sounds like a silly, frivolous little thing, but has actually lent itself to really great branding for the work that we've been doing. We went through this with Memorial Regional, and we didn't have a name for our consortium. We were just like the Northwest Colorado Consortium. There's a ton of different Northwest Colorado substance use related organizations in that area. So nobody really knew what we did. And we ended up hiring a designer who helped us make a logo. We voted on the logo and the name and everything. And now that logo goes on everything for trainings and webinars and marketing things and the website. That carries across everything. It sounds like a silly thing, but it's something that built a lot of participation as well as pride, I think, across the consortium for the work that we were doing, is to have a name and an image associated with that to brand our work.
I'm putting in the website here. It's don't laugh. It's not perfect yet, but it's pretty good, and we're growing it slowly. I was gonna say, one thing to remember, when you create anything, except for like weekly emails, the HRSA disclaimer needs to go on everything. So if you create print materials, if you create a website, you need to have that disclaimer on the website, which is somewhere on our website, I promise, or it will be. So let's see. Yeah, and I think, the website, if you're going to do it, I would outsource to somebody. But it has been fun, and I would reemphasize like some of the things that we've done, like picking the background picture for our website or choosing the name or choosing the logo, have been kind of fun things that like help to get people engaged. And, is it a distraction from like the core stuff? Yeah, but it's also been really fun, and I think has helped maintain engagement to have a few days where it's a little more like light, more choosing a name. We also, I think, I donated to somebody's nonprofit because they chose the winning name. So we've done little contests like that to pick the logo or to pick the name for the consortium. Next slide.
So there's been a lot of great opportunities that have come out of strong leadership that we've experienced on all of the grants. And like I said earlier, it's been really important for us to reach out early in the grant writing process before we even apply. But for folks who might be working on your grant, but it's also equally important to reach out to other organizations who might be going after the same grant. To make sure that you're combining forces, not duplicating effort. And we've really seen this as areas for complementing each other with our work and ensuring that we're supporting each other across Colorado. So on the planning grant, JK, I don't know if you remember how many planning grantees there were, but there were quite a few across Colorado. I think off the top of my head, maybe like four. Yes,
four in like 100-mile radius in Western Colorado.
Yep. So we reached out to those folks as soon as we were all awarded, talked with them early on, compared our work plan initiatives, and chatted about areas that we could support each other so we're not doing the same initiatives multiple times across Colorado. And that's been really great. But one of the other things that we did was invite those organizations to our planning grant consortium meetings that were in person. So one example of this is Mid-Valley Family Practice. They were in a very close by region to us. They were a little bit more grassroots with their planning grant, super community based, which was awesome, and a lot smaller from a regional perspective as far as how many counties were encompassed with their grant. And they attended a number of our consortium monthly meetings to share out what was happening in their grant, and they actually ended up joining forces with us for implementation. So they had their own planning grant separate from St. Mary's, but then joined on with us for implementation so that we're all under the same grant. And that was a great way for them to continue doing the work that they wanted to continue in their community and build off of what they accomplished in their planning grant, and to keep a lot of those initiatives and objectives moving through implementation while we handled a lot of the administrative things. So combining forces with other grantees is great to avoid duplication. And I think it really makes both the application process a lot stronger, but also when you're implementing things quite a bit stronger too, to have force in numbers and combined brain power. All right, next slide, please. So we've talked a bit about the forming and storming phases, and now the last two phases are really when you hit your stride and you get into the norming and performing, and that's when the exciting work really happens after the groundwork has been laid, and now you're moving into really accomplishing objectives along the way. And making meaningful changes in the communities that you're all working in. And JK, you're going to touch a little bit about how our meetings have changed over time as we've transitioned through those stages.
Yeah, our meetings now, they go a lot, I would say they go a lot faster, but there's actually a lot more like chatter. People know each other a lot better. So there's a lot of, not socializing, but talking about things we're working on together. So I'd say that's a difference in that. Also, people are used to like our standing agenda. So and when I run a work group, we have like 5 to 10 minutes of kind of social, like what are your group updates that people just kind of volunteer. And then we move into old business and we move into new business. And sometimes we'll have a speaker too. And then we're pretty work plan driven also. Like we're always looking at our work plan. And we have, I would say in each work group, 2 to 3 initiatives that we're actively working on, usually 1 or 2 bigger ones and 1 or 2 smaller ones. So for instance, right now in recovery work group, or actually in prevention work group, we've hired a marketer to do stigma reduction. So that's a big part of our work. We are working on, treatment, like stigma reduction, treatment availability brochures, and that one's almost done. And then we're also working on an initiative to get people more PT and less prescription opioids. And a lot of those are running through nonprofits that are already doing that work. So I would say if you ask people in our work group, most of them would know what our big initiatives are, which is a big win, that they're aware of what's going on. Other things, as far as this year that are different, people are really used to recovery being at the center. They're used to people talking about recovery. They know about recovery in the local area, which I think used to be kind of a black box. So that's been made more transparent. And let's see, I think in this one, in the one in Northwest Colorado, we're underspending a bit. And so people know that they can suggest programs for spending, and that we'll consider those and hopefully improve on them as we consider them. So, I mean, those are some of the big things. Like people are just used to the flow of things. They know they're going to get an email every week. They know there's going to be a meeting every 2 weeks. They know there's going to be a big group every month. And then when we have something out of that, they know about it too. Like we had the Attorney General's office show up to talk about settlement money. And I put that in the chat. Big suggestion. If you don't know where the settlement's going in your state, figure it out and get them to attend your big group and talk about the settlement. I guess Colorado has the settlement figured out, which feels like a strange accusation. but there's someone in your state knows about it. And that's, for us, probably the key, most key thing as far as sustainability of the implementation grant is settlement money. So that is high on the list of suggestions for me. But that's, yeah, sorry, I'm off topic about heading your stride. We can go to the next slide.
Thanks. So the norming phase is really when resolved disagreements and personality clashes result in greater intimacy and a spirit of cooperation emerges. So in this stage, team members are starting to take responsibility for different work plan initiatives or different activities, and they have a lot of ambition to work on the success of the overall consortium's goals. So one of the things that we keep doing during norming, and I know we've talked about it a lot, is getting folks used to having recovery at the center, making sure that we have those stories of recovery consistently. But beyond that, also really making sure that peers are engaged in our work. And that's something I think we've gotten a lot better at as time has gone on, is having more peer recovery specialists be part of the work. Obviously part of the recovery work groups that we have, but across those as well. I have 2 peers that are in the treatment work group for the Memorial Grant. And then we have 1 work group on the SCL grant that probably has 5 or 6 peers that attend very regularly. And that work group has made a big push for recovery initiatives, and specifically to have a peer advocacy council in the region too. So as we've moved into norming, it's been very easy to find speakers to attend both the work groups and the consortium-wide monthly meetings. And so we really try to lean on experts if we don't know the answer to something or don't have best practices for something, is to reach out and get experts on those areas. And a great resource for that is your HRSA TA folks. Many of you maybe have worked with Donald McDonald, who is fabulous. He does a lot of peer work and recovery focused work. But we've also reached out to organizations like Chow Now, which is a hospitality focused organization here in Colorado, and they do a lot of work around the culinary, bar and restaurant industries, as well as hotels and things like that, which is important for us because both of our RCORP grants have major resort towns in them. Steamboat Springs is a big ski resort. Vail and Aspen are also 2 major resort towns, and many of you probably know that there is implicit substance use that happens at a pretty high level in the resort towns. And there's also a lot of struggles with temporary workers and just housing costs in general of being able to bring skilled substance use workforce into those areas and retaining them. So Chow Now has come to speak about some initiatives they have for incentivizing people going to groups for counseling and things like that. And they give out small tokens like water bottles and such, but really bringing in experts on particular items that we need help with, or to support the work of the work groups as well. And as we mentioned before, our work groups are usually 8 to 10 people, but our bigger groups that are meeting on the monthly calls are pretty large, around 25 to 30 on one and a little bit higher on the other. And again, we're constantly recanvassing to find those lost or new organizations and reaching out. So on the Memorial Grant, we realized we were missing one of the hospitals in the region that we'd had a really hard time engaging with early on. They weren't a part of the planning grant or the first year of implementation. And we made a really concerted effort to reach out and get them to join. And they've been a great member. They're also the only organization in that region that does any OB work. And so they were super important to have for the PIMS reporting, as well as just to have representation for that population as well. And we found that now that we're in the norming phase, attendance is really consistent. Folks actually let us know if they're not going to attend a work group meeting, which is something I wasn't anticipating. They email us ahead of time and say, hey, I'll be on the road or I'll be with a patient, not going to make it, but here are my to-do items and what I accomplished that you can share out. Follow up with me if you need me to do anything after the meeting. So folks are really dedicated to their roles on the grant and to the work plan initiatives that they're responsible for, which is great.
So another quote about this: they start tolerating the whims and fancies of the other team members. They accept others as they are and make an effort to move on. The danger here is that members may be so focused on preventing conflict that they are reluctant to share controversial ideas. Again, we've actually found that a little bit of conflict is good. We had one organization that brought forward a proposal for youth mental health first aid. And it was, I think it duplicated some things that were already going on in the community. And she got, I wouldn't say kind of negative. I mean, she got constructive feedback. People were not just, giving a thumbs up to a proposal, ended up making the proposal much more specific, cut down the ask a little bit, and ultimately it was unanimously approved. So I think that, in the norming phase, we've managed to have some conflict, but have it be good. So that's felt really good as someone who's totally comfortable with conflict. And we've had a lot of new requests to join consortium. Like I said, we don't even really reach out. We usually somebody in the consortium emails us and CCs somebody else and says, hey, I'd like you to meet this person. Skate Church is a good one. It's a youth skate and faith-based prevention and recovery organization. So they work with youth before they develop SUD or after, and build around Christ and skateboarding foundation for recovery, which is a pretty cool thing to have in a small town. And then, as Lindsay said, we had a lot of public health agencies that we've re-engaged. So another important thing to note at this point, we're still referencing our work plan really frequently, but we're also balancing that with, on our grants, we're a year and a half in on one of them and about 6-7 months in on the other one. So, for the one that's a year and a half, it's been 2 years since they wrote that grant, right? And so a lot's changed since then. So we're balancing what was written in the work plan with what's actually still going on in the region, and developing organically. And so I think that's really important because it keeps things relevant for people in the group. Like, we are not just reading the work plan and saying, oh, we need to do this because our work plan says this. We look at it and we say, hey, how has this changed? How can we make this relevant in this region? And so the work plan is a living document, and it's being altered all the time, frankly, to suit the needs of people locally and the capacity of the organizations in our consortium. And I put some notes in there around PIMS. Susan, what is the specific name of the settlement lawsuit? So it's the opioid settlement lawsuit. I don't know if there's a better name for it, but I think ours is going through our attorney general and then through counties. Each state's doing it differently, but I think the attorney general would be the place to start in your state to see where, like, some of it will come through the attorney general's office, some of it will come through your single state agency, some of it will go out to like regions. A lot of ours goes to groups of counties in the state. About 60% goes to like regional groups of counties. And so I would check with your attorney general, and they might be able to give you more specifics, or it might still be kind of stuck at the attorney general's office. But being on top of that is really important. Okay, next slide.
So these slides are meant to summarize us a little bit so far about some key take-home tips for leading successful RCORP grants. So the budget is really first up with that, and that's in the writing the budget is an important stage. We've learned that the hard way on one of our grants to really make sure that we can spend that down. As I mentioned earlier, one of our grants has had a little bit of a hard time spending things down, and we're pretty much caught up now, but making sure the budget has money set aside for providing funding for PIMS providers, as well as work group leads too, and other incentives, and that it can be flexible. And we really want to make sure that it's transparent as well. So we've touched on a few times how the project director did a brief presentation on those monthly meetings, in order to show folks where we were at with our spending, what our line items looked like, where we could tap in, and some spending ideas for the next upcoming year. And we ended up doing that around Christmas time, actually, as a fun discussion to have about future spending. So if you don't already do that, folks really like the transparency that goes along with looking at the line items, and exactly where dollars are flowing within your grant too. And you really want them to be flexible enough to respond to conditions over the span of the grant. The implementation grants are 3 years long. We want to make sure that those budgets are flexible and can really accomplish the work that would be meaningful in the region over time too. And we've touched on this a lot and we'll keep touching on it, is the focus on lived experience of having lots of people who are in active recovery as part of our work groups, lots of peers, and sharing those stories out and really making sure that they're compensated for their time as well. They're not just token folks, and making sure that they're represented at all of our big meetings. And it's been great to center people on our work plan and our initiatives as a whole, is to keep bringing people back to success stories of recovery too. JK, did you have any more on budget?
I mean, I promised we would try to give you concrete tips. No, so this is it. This is the best we've got. This is the next page. I mean, I think the big one, if you haven't figured this out, it's all about the story, you know, in everything. It's really a story. We start every grant application with a story. We start every consortium meeting with a story. That's what drives people in substance use and a lot of other things in life. And it connects it to people in the area. We recently had a really sad story, actually outside Memorial, where a woman and took her 2 kids out into a snowstorm, and she was on methamphetamine, and one of the kids died from exposure. And it was like really, again, halfway through the grant, like reminded everybody why we're doing this. Like we could prevent things like that through the implementation grant and the psychostimulant grant. And that's the goal, is that we don't have stories like that. And we have a lot more stories of people in recovery. Yeah, I mean, these are the tips. Budget, I can't, like we've learned so much about budgeting through these grants. I will say, you know, if you're struggling with like your budget, you feel like your budget's very locked in, talk to your HRSA folks and your JBS folks, particularly to your HRSA folks, about, you know, how flexible your budget is, because we've learned that there is some flexibility to, you know, make your budget relevant to what's going on right now in your area, and the changing, you know, just the changing goings on in the nation and in the state and in your region. So that's all I'll say about that. But I think the formed and transparent and flexible strikes a balance between like how you want your budget to be. I think one of the most exciting things for us as facilitators is spending, like changing the budget a little bit and spending money. So it's really addressing local needs. And that is also one of the things that gets, I think, the best engagement from our consortium is both proposing and making decisions on the budget. So that's something that I think I'm probably most surprised about, is like how we've been able to change some of our budgeting and spending to make things like work a lot better and get more buy-in from people. Next slide. So I said that that was everything. We've got more tips. One of the things that I think we have done probably better than everything else, except putting recovery at the center, is delegating and networking. We really multiply how much work we're getting by working with statewide nonprofits, with HRSA and with JBS. There's tons of resources out there through HRSA and JBS that you should make sure you're utilizing. There are lots of national and state nonprofits. And I think a lot of times people just look at what's going on in the region. We have, you know, there's so much going on. We named a couple of them here. A rural transportation assistance program. That's a national nonprofit that's helped guide us to better transportation in one of our regions. Shatterproof's a nonprofit that does advocacy, and we're working with them on a recovery ready workplace initiative. Working Partners also does workplace initiatives. These are just some examples. There are dozens other national nonprofits doing work that you should invite to speak at your work group. And that's how we engage them. We say, hey, you know, if we find one that we like what they're doing, we just ask them to come speak at our work group. And great example of this, we're going to do this recovery ready workplace initiative, and we were going to spend all this time doing it on our own. We looked on the website and we found that Connecticut already has a great recovery ready workplace initiative. So I just emailed the person in the Connecticut Recovery Ready Workplace Initiative, and I said, hey, can we talk? And she made time for me. I said, hey, can we take your toolkit and just make it into Colorado? And she said, sure. So we got this like 60-page toolkit And all we have to do is make it Colorado instead of Connecticut. So I really can't emphasize enough, this can save you a lot of time from reinventing the wheel and just make things better. Like they have this great toolkit. We don't need to redo it. And then on the state front, I'm kind of going from the bottom up here. We have a Colorado RX consortium that's built around what's called collaborative. What's it called, Lindsay? The when you work together toward a common goal, collaborative leadership or something initiative. And their job is to help community consortiums like ours do our job. And so they have people who are experts in treatment recovery, engaging families, harm reduction, who will talk, and they're actually going to do some of this adaptation of the Recovery Ready Workplace initiative for us, because they're going to adopt it as a state. So we really harness what's going on in the region, in the state, in the country, through the grants. And like I said, that's multiplied and made things easier for us. And then we work with other HRSA grants. So good example, we have a marketer for Northwest Colorado. We're going to share their products with another grant in Western Colorado, like kind of similar areas. No reason not to share with them. And so we reach out to other HRSA grants and share with them. We had somebody from California talk to us about their marketing initiative. It's been really helpful to work with other folks. And then, as I said earlier, communicate successes, both internally to keep people engaged and externally. This is something this is definitely the growing edge for me. We have conferences, we have campaigns, we're going to have social media, website. And I know all this stuff sounds like stuff you might not want to do. So we find other people who are good at doing it. And part of that, I will give some credit for, we have some capstone students from our local Master's of Public Health program. Look to your local universities, counseling programs to find interns, because a lot of these things we're talking about, they can do it better than us. They can organize meetings, they can write text for our website. And so we've gotten a lot of mileage and really good education from some interns and capstone students from local universities. Next slide. Lindsay, do you have anything else on that slide?
I do not. You covered all our tips and tricks.
Cool.
All right, so the performing stage is the last stage that we're going to talk about today. It is really when your consortium hits its full stride and is running itself for the most part. And a great example of that is that our work groups happen without us at this point. JK and I are both leaders on a number of the work groups, but if we are not there, if we are out sick or out of office for some reason, other folks will facilitate those without very much input at all from us, which is great. They'll help create the consortium agendas for the day. They'll take meeting minutes, all of that. So at this point, everything is well oiled on both of those grants, and things happen without very much input from JK or myself, which is great from a facilitator standpoint, is to have everybody self-sustainable at this stage in the performing stage of things. And another great example of that is happened in JK's work group, but there was a meeting that they had on New Year's Eve. It just happened to fall on New Year's Eve because it's a standing meeting, and all the work group members still elected to meet on New Year's Eve. Obviously, they were given the option to move it for a non-holiday, but everyone wanted to meet and continue with their agenda items as planned. So people are really committed to the work at this stage during performing. And really importantly, as JK touched on a little bit, it's not only becoming evident to folks who are within the consortium and just regionally, but it's also spreading outside of the consortium to more of a state level. So that's a great mark of knowing that you've hit the performing phase, is when you're getting asked to speak at statewide things about the work that's happening. We mentioned Heidi Williams and the Opioid Task Force with the Attorney General's office. We're now giving input to the state on some funding priorities for these areas with the opioid settlement dollars, and engaging county commissioners and other stakeholders on our work to get their ear as settlement money starts flowing down. But also on other initiatives as well. We had an initiative on the Memorial Project to allocate some funding for PDMP or prescription drug monitoring program to fully integrate it into the electronic health records of some of our organizations who hadn't done that yet. And it turns out the state is also working in parallel on some programs related to that. So we've chatted with them about that as well and what we've done in our region. So really getting external communications out to folks who are more stakeholders at the statewide level has been a great mark of knowing that we're performing to spread the knowledge and the successes of the region as a whole. And again, we're always reaching out to fill any gaps in our knowledge with HRSA or JBS guest speakers. Again, I can't emphasize enough, Donald McDonald is fantastic if you have not had him yet. He's been really great and has made an appearance at a number of our meetings. So utilize the TA that you guys have through HRSA. They have a number of resources and people who are dedicated to help you with your cause, and use your time wisely while you have them on for technical assistance. JK, anything else you want to add?
I think we covered a lot of it. I mean, yeah, I can't emphasize enough, like we've offered to decrease the frequency of meetings a couple times and people won't do it. Like they want to keep meeting twice a week in work groups and once a month in big groups. But it's like kind of surprising because, you know, we want to respect their time and meet as little as we can and get things done, but people are really gung-ho about continuing at the current cadence. And yeah, the bottom, I can't tell you, like a surprising amount gets done. It's amazing when I look at where we were a year ago, really no work plan objectives have gotten done. None of them have even gotten started. They hadn't even started meeting 6 months into their grant. And now we're, you know, people come to us from the state and other states and they ask what we're doing. And all that's happened in the last year through a pretty small area. I think there's in Northwest Colorado, like 40,000, not even 40,000, like 35,000 people in the area. So it's a lot. And it's just amazing how far we've come in a year.
Next slide, please. So our last few slides as we wrap up are meant to be a little bit more interactive, and there are a number of you on here, 46 still, so I think we better utilize the chat function so that we don't overwhelm the airwaves here. But I do want to give everyone a chance to highlight some of the successes that they've had, and you can use these questions on here as a guide, but we want to hear a little bit of feedback about what has gone successfully in your consortium so far in your grant period. So go ahead and utilize the chat just to share a few thoughts of those and successes. Great, Jerry, thanks for sharing. Working with other RCORP and grantees, that's been really important for us too, as we've emphasized today. Anybody else? Good networking, everyone.
Are you two working together? Because that would be amazing. You just had the same answer. Social members.
Yeah, adding consortium members and filling in those gaps has been really important to us. So the more that you can reach out to people and engage new folks, that's been really great.
So on Kim's bringing in guest speakers, I have found in our work groups that, there's definitely like too many and too little guest speakers. When we bring in guest speakers about every 4 to 6 meetings, that seems to work pretty well for us because usually those guest speakers leave us with some like to-dos. Like one came and they are culinary and hospitality outreach and wellness. So they do essentially support meetings for restaurant workers is their main thing. And they are doing them mostly online. And as they get back into things, they are looking to do them in person. And so it was great because it was like, all right, clearly the ask for them is that we need some people in Vail, and Aspen that want to start this group. We need 3 or 4 people who are reliable, who work in the hospitality industry that want to start this group and learn from Chow and start a group there. And then, we have something to follow up on for the next couple of weeks. So when we do that every 4, 5, 6 meetings, it generates enough like new thinking and to-dos to keep us going for a while. So our guest speakers compensated, not for work groups, because they're usually, they're usually like small nonprofits, which is not to say that we shouldn't compensate them, but it's only a 10-minute talk, and it's really more aimed at networking and furthering their initiatives than like didactics, like learning. Lindsay and I just came up on this. We have a subject matter expert who's giving a talk on OB-GYN to some of our consortium members. And this is more of a, like I said, didactic learning thing. And or at least we've been talking about compensating him, and I think we're going to compensate him with an honorarium. So it depends. And I realize this is like a dangerous thing, because if we're compensating doctors and we're not compensating people in recovery, then that creates some inequity in how we're treating our guests. So that's a good reminder that we need to maybe formalize this policy.
Great. And other comments coming in are talking about lots of engagements and conversations going on and people participating. Beverly, you're noting criminal justice personnel came in to your MAT program. That's great. The more that you can involve criminal justice, the better, I think. That's an area that we could definitely improve upon. And we set up an ad hoc work group in order to address that on our memorial grant as well, and really contact some of the sheriff offices and bring them in because they were feeling a little bit ostracized.
And that's something we've used judiciously. We've had 2 ad hoc work groups when we found something that was either too big for a work group or were really difficult to engage. So we have an ad hoc criminal justice work group that's run by a guy who works in a jail, who works on our team, who's got a really good relationship with those criminal justice folks. And then the other one is transportation. It's just a big enough initiative. We felt like it needed its own work group, and it's a time limited. We're going to try to run it for, I said 6 months. I think we're closer to 9 months now, but we are going to end that at some point and then just funnel it into another group.
Great. All right. I do want to leave a tiny bit of time to touch on challenges here. So I think we'll move on. Next slide, please. I'm glad that everyone's had a lot of engagement. It seems like there's been a lot of participation and communication happening across all of your grants. So same thing for this slide. I just want to acknowledge some of the challenges that we're facing as well. And this may be helpful for the HRSA folks who are on this call helping with the TA to hear a little bit about challenges that you might be encountering as well. So please use the chat just to list a couple of those real quickly. And I think we've touched on some of our challenges today as far as making sure we have the right people engaged, following up with folks that we might have lost. Our budget spending has been an issue on one of our grants, and really making sure that that's been transparent and getting our spending back on track. Anyone else for challenges or areas that you would change if you were to do this again? Jerry, you're saying state programs. Could you elaborate on that? Oh, JK, yep.
I was just going to say for Charles, like usually when we want to go back and address something, we kind of, if you ask people what they want to see, you're going to get like 20 different answers or no answers. When we give them, I look at the work plan and say like, okay, this one looks ready to go. I think we're ready to do something on this. We usually come back with like 3 or 4, you're doing implementation. Yeah. So that's what we're doing too. I come back with like 3 or 4 things from the work plan that I think are, ready to move along. And then it's a lot easier discussion to go through those and choose 1 or 2 rather than like opening it up too far for people. I've just found that we have more success when we limit the number of decisions people have to make. Grant and non-COVID environment. Yeah, that'd be nice. We are planning our first in-person in September since COVID started, which we're really excited about.
Julia, it sounds like you guys hit the ground running and had a good structure from the get-go. That's great. And trust, yeah, that's a good factor to mention too. Well, I hope all of the tips and tricks that we gave everyone today can help with any challenges that you're experiencing, but please feel free to reach out as well if you have more follow-up questions. Next slide, please, and we'll wrap us up here. Some of you may have seen similar resources from Mary Kay, but these are some great books. JK and I have read most of these and have found them really helpful from a leadership perspective. So if you're looking for some reading that can guide leading big consortiums that have a lot of objectives and lots of people and how to keep that on track, these are really great foundational resources. And then next slide, please. And that is all. I know we don't have too much time for questions, but JK and I are certainly available offline as well. And our contact information is on here. So please feel free to reach out if you have further questions or want to talk further about your consortium too.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. Great discussion. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for that great discussion and presentation. Very practical and realistic based on what our grantees are working with, as you can tell from the response. So we do have a quick wrap-up session if you all want to click to the next thing and hear a little bit about what's going on tomorrow. But JK and Lindsay, thanks again so much.